Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of A Conversation with Cometan. This is Season 2, Episode 8, and in this video, I'm going to be lecturing you today on the second sort of section, really, of the Total Immersion into Astronism lecture. In the previous episode, we looked at Astro Futurology. We explored really in great depth it's kind of really the narrative of Astronism, the fundamental belief systems, structures, and everything like that. So in this episode, we're going to take a look at Astronist Philosophy. This is probably one of the first times that I've actually managed to sort of sit down and really explore the fundamental sides of the Astronist philosophy, which is kind of really, it complements the Astro Futurology and sort of the more religious aspects of astronism, but also is very much distinct and is very much sort of in its own lane, really, when it comes to exploring different types of topics. In this sort of section, we'll be covering things like the meaning of life, kind of just fundamental philosophical views that astronism has, ontology, possibly a bit of metaphysics and epistemology. So all these great sort of philosophical disciplines we're going to be covering in a sort of varying amounts of detail. Sometimes, you know, we call this Astronist philosophy the Cometanic way because I'm Cometan and this is my philosophy essentially. So sometimes we may refer to this as Cometanic philosophy if we want to be more specific to sort of my contributions to Astronist philosophy. But really, Astronist philosophy is a sort of broader sort of term, really, that encompasses both my approaches to astronism and my understandings of astronism, as well as other people's approaches to astronism, other astronist sort of understandings and approaches. So in the first subsection, we're going to be looking at how astronism sees the world. So what are the foundations of Astronist philosophy? Well, really, the crux of Astronist philosophy is that you should really live your life sort of as proximate to the astronomical world as absolutely possible. That is the Astronist philosophy in a nutshell, essentially. The way that you do that, the means by which you approximate to the astronomical world, and sort of the sort of forms that you may do that in. So whether that be spiritual, whether that be intellectual, whether that be physical, these different sort of mediums or vehicles for approximating to the astronomical world, you know, they're all encompassed under this idea that, yes, a person's life who is an astronist is centered on this concept of proximation. And essentially, this is also connected to the idea of living in tune with the phenomena of the night sky and doing that as much as possible. You know, this kind of way of life really guides behavior towards the resolutions of astrosis and cosmosis. We spoke about those, particularly astrosis, in the previous section about Astro Futurology. Yeah, so really what Astronist philosophy is trying to provide is a sort of guide, really, to achieving astrosis, living in a way that will get to these resolutions. I think that's really interesting. The sort of idea that astrosis and cosmosis are resolutions in some way, are sort of climaxes, are sort of resolutions for the individual person. Whereas in the previous section on Astro Futurology, we primarily looked at the resolutions for humanity as a whole. So again, this Astronist philosophy is really about living in proximity with the astronomical world. That is, you know, that can be interpreted in many different ways, and it has been, and it should be interpreted in many different ways. It's a broad enough statement to sort of create sort of a wide breadth of understanding and approaches and dialogue, but it's also very much astronistic in its theme and in its nature and in its sort of goals, really. So this proximation does not take place within a moral, immoral paradigm. This is really, really important. Neither does it take place within a theist-atheist paradigm. And these are paradigms that have been established by other religions, which are fine, it's fine. But in Astronism, we don't have these paradigms, or that these paradigms are not given sort of a central focus. We just see the world in a different way. We don't immediately ascribe a sort of moralistic, amoralistic, or immoralistic understanding to phenomena around us, nor do we ascribe a sort of theistic, atheistic paradigm. You know, those types of understandings are sort of connected to other philosophies and religions rather than Astronism. These attributions to the process of proximation can be made by individuals according to their preference. So if you want to make sort of this process of proximation to the astronomical world a moralistic process, or a theistic atheistic in a theistic atheistic paradigm, then you have obviously the freedom to do that. But Astronist philosophy simply states the centrality of this process in revealing truth as it relates to the self and as it relates to the collective. So essentially what I'm trying to say there is that, you know, the essence of Astronist philosophy is to focus on the astronomical world, cosmocentrism, rather than theocentrism or moral centrism, or these other types of paradigms, really. Not to say that these other paradigms don't have a role or aren't important, but they're not the central focus, and they're not our immediate understanding when we think about these topics. Although ethical precepts may be found throughout Astronist philosophy, it would be inaccurate to describe Astronism as a moralistic or even a theistic or atheistic philosophy. This is because these topics, although they are addressed to varying degrees in Astronist thought, are not central, because Astronism is not moral-centric or theocentric, as I've just explained. This is because such systems that do express concern for these attributes hold different purposes and different goals than does Astronism. So what I'm trying to say there is that, for example, Christianity and Islam, they have different goals than Astronism. Whether a person can be a Christian and an Astronist at the same time is another question that should be addressed later on. But what I'm expressly trying to say here is that Astronism has a different set of purposes, it has a different set of goals than some of the religions. And so because of that, the paradigms that we have, the most important paradigms that we sort of have, are sort of different from these other religions because our goals and purposes in Astronism are different. Instead, as we have already delineated, Astronism is cosmocentric, so what does not come to affect a person's or all humanity's relations with the astronomical world does not primarily concern Astronism. So essentially what I'm saying there is that, you know, if an event or a question or an issue does not immediately affect the astronomical world or humanities or individuals' relations with the astronomical world, then this is not of primary concern to Astronism. That doesn't mean that Astronist philosophy doesn't address such an issue, but it just means that it's not of primary concern, you know? And this is the same for other religions. I mean, if you look at Christianity, there are topics within Christianity that are of more importance and are of more stress and emphasis than other topics because of the goals of Christianity and because of its purposes, the reasons why it was established in the first place. So a belief system or philosophy's goals and kind of its sort of purposes are directly going to influence the paradigms that belief system sort of focuses on and holds centrally. So instead, what is given a central place, and as a result, extensive rumination in Astronism, is the individual and collective human condition as it relates to the night sky, our understanding of it, our relations with it, and our proximity to it. This is because, as I referred to in the previous lecture episode, the astronomical world is regarded as the existential source of humanity. And so because of that, this is why Astronist philosophy is, regarding or giving primary importance to the nature of the astronomical world as it relates to the human. Important is that Astronism asserts that its system of beliefs, theory, and practice is the prime mover for executing this plan of proximation. Sometimes we also refer to it as transcension, which it achieves through its economy of transcension. Again, we're bringing more sort of astro-soteriological terms in here, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that the Astronist system has been established in order to execute the plan of proximation via the economy of transcension through its management of transcension, essentially. It's trying to, Astronist philosophy, or the Astronist belief system, is trying to approximate humanity to the astronomical world. And the way that we do this is through the management of the process of transcension, essentially. So what needs to be stressed is that Astronist philosophy is intended to be used for and what its goals are. And defining what its purposes and goals are is really primary or central to understanding sort of the Astronist system as a whole. So really, the essence of Astronist philosophy is to ignite and establish an individual's personal relations with and proximity to the astronomical world, whether this be in a spiritual sense, a religious sense, an emotional sense, or in an existential or philosophical sense. So again, this is sort of open to the individual in that sense. This is also to do the same, but for society or humanity as a whole. Such a mass proximation, which is what we call transcension when we're talking in sort of astro-soteriological terms, holds different preconditions and numerous consequences that, although may correspond to an individual, far outreach the scope of a singular or single person. So essentially what I'm trying to say there is that, of course, the process of proximation for the individual is very much a different process than, and really sort of a very, very minuscule version of the process of proximation for all humanity. Okay, so those two processes are very, very different. They have different consequences, they have different implications, and we need to consider those. Okay, to promote the principle of anotheia, that the astronomical world is both central in life and in death, a principle that captures all astronism. So the goal of Astronism is to promote this idea of anotheia, which I've already explained in the previous lecture, and essentially, yeah, that sort of captures really all of Astronist philosophy. I would say that, through this principle of anotheia, this idea that the astronomical world is central in both life and in death, which captures sort of a corporeal existence and the potential for a post-corporeal existence. This really captures all of Astronism, really. This really captures the essence of Astronist philosophy and also captures the purposes and goals of this philosophy. So before proceeding on, it is perhaps important to highlight the reoccurring proximity and proximation words, okay? So proximity in this sense simultaneously refers to a physical closeness, a spiritual closeness, an emotional closeness, an ideological closeness, and an existential closeness. So there's these sort of 5 closenesses that proximity, when we refer to proximity or proximation, this is what we're referring to. It encompasses all these different closenesses that are acting simultaneously, depending on how a person wishes to engage with their proximation to the astronomical world. It is these 5 closenesses that astronists should intend to cultivate throughout their lives, yet with the scope for focusing one's time and attention on just 1 or 2 of these proximities rather than all 5. So what I'm trying to say there is that, life is busy, life is hectic and distracting. So, for the vast majority of astronists, maybe doing a really good approximation of just 1 or 2 of these forms of closeness is maybe the best and most practical or realistic approach for the majority of astronists. So one may say, why is proximation to the astronomical world so centrally important or justifiable in Astronist philosophy? Well, Astronist philosophy answers this by saying that the aforementioned principle that the astronomical world is humanity's existential source. I think I've spoken about this many, many times. It is the place that we as humans have always, since prehistoric times, during the scope of man, have attributed our origins and our resolutions to both as a species and as individuals. And it is through Astronism that this tradition of attribution shall continue. So what I'm essentially trying to say there is that since the scope of man, there has existed really a fundamental sort of innate, really, urge or tendency for humanity to resolve itself through the astronomical world, to attribute things to the astronomical world in order to explain life, in order to explain existence. So astronism really is just trying to continue on this tradition, of course, moving away from what we call the controversion, but trying to continue on this tradition of attribution through really trying to emphasize this idea of proximity and the idea of resolution, which is, again, really an interesting idea. This idea that the astronomical world encompasses really sort of resolution, encompasses a sort of, in a way, a sort of a resolution to life, really. And this is kind of what we're trying to say when we're talking about the existential source, isn't it? We're trying to say that, that really the astronomical world is the resolution to, in a way, our woes, our problems in many ways, both as individuals and as, and as a whole species. So I've spoken a lot about astrosis, and in the previous lecture primarily. And really, again, astrosoteriology was split into sort of the personal form and the collective form. And again, in this sort of astrophilosophical approach, when we're using the terms proximity, again, there's this personal proximity. Astronism calls for proximity Astronism calls for proximity to the astronomical world, both in a public and in a personal sense. So, of course, personal proximity encompasses the activities that you engage with as an individual that will lead to your personal transcension, your astrosis. These activities are regarded to contribute to the overall transcension of humankind. I think I spoke about that in the previous lecture when we were talking about how, your actions as an individual have a varying degree of effect on all humanity, maybe no effect, maybe very little effect. But if you engage with scope, if you get to that astrosis stage, then you will really have contributed to the overall human transcension, okay? And again, this will also lead to influence other people's astroses. This idea that really, this idea that if you attain astrosis and someone else sees that you've attained astrosis, or that you're really devoted and trying to achieve astrosis during your lifetime, then this will no doubt influence other people to do that, and will eventually, of course, begin to help all humanity as a whole, at the transcension of all humanity, which is what we've come to now with what we call collective proximity. So this idea that, the collective proximity encompasses all those activities conducted by either all humanity or of a particular society that really directly or immediately impact the process of transcension. Really what collective proximity therefore relates to is sort of the activities that, you know, a society engages with as part of the process of transcension, but as not sort of encompassing the entire process of transcension, not as synonymous with the process of transcension, but as sort of contributing to it. Examples of this could include tuition, sort of spreading the Astronist message, engagement in space exploration, or teaching people as much as possible about sort of personal transcension and astrosis. Space expansion is one thing, space education, again, just sort of philosophical and or sort of religious activity that is geared towards the astronomical world, all these types of things that a society or human species can engage with are all sort of leading to this, or all encompassed by this sort of collective proximity. That's those set of activities really that we engage with in order to achieve eventually transcension. So Astronism regards the question of the meaning of life. This is where we're coming into the meaning of life now. So we've sort of explored this idea of proximity. We've explored this idea of, you know, the idea of proximation. You know, the Astronist philosophy really focuses on proximating the individual and humanity as a whole to the astronomical world. How does this then relate to the meaning of life? You know, Astronism concerns itself over the situation of the human condition. It is concerned with the fulfillment and justification of this through the exploration of expansion into and proximation towards the astronomical world. And this sort of principle really of anotheia, that life and death are really sort of intertwined with the astronomical world, that this is connected then to the meaning of life and how astronists or Astronist system and philosophy approaches the question of the meaning of life. But before we do that, what I wanted to talk about just quickly was this concept of re-physicalization. So re-physicalization is a mentality that emerges as a result of Astronism's focus on the astronomical world as humanity's existential source. It asserts that as a product of cosmocentrism, Astronism primarily emphasizes the physical, specifically the astronomical, rather than the ethereal or spiritual, to answer existential questions. So you may have, depending on how much research you've done about other religions, there is definitely an ethereal spiritual focus for religion, essentially. And of course, Astronism does have religious sides, and it does have a spiritual tradition, which is what we call prismata. But really, sort of, Astronism is very physical in many ways. It tries to sort of answer questions about life, about the meaning of life, about existential questions through a sort of physical answer, or as much as possible as sort of astronomical answers to the meaning of life. And this process of making sort of a belief system more physical is what we call physicalization. And of course, I'm using the term re-physicalization here to refer to the idea that the controversion made it too much about sort of the metaphysical things we can't see, sort of relying on blind faith in a way. And Astronism is trying to re-physicalize to some degree, not entirely, but to some degree re-physicalize or make more of a balance between the physical and the metaphysical. Okay, so re-physicalization is predicated on the notion that prehistorically, especially during the scope of man and following the scope of man, humans sustain their answers to existential questions through physical phenomena, such as by way of celestial bodies. Yes, they may have they may have attributed spirits to these celestial bodies, but essentially what we're fundamentally talking about here are physical entities, which were the sun, the moon, the stars. These are physical entities. These are not sort of invisible or metaphysical or purely spiritual entities. Yes, animism was important. The attribution of spirits to these entities, or the attribute or the sort of deification of these entities, was definitely part of this process of early religion. But essentially, we can understand that this was a very physical understanding of the world, that, you know, when they looked up at the night sky, they saw physical objects. They weren't imagining these objects. These objects were there. Yes, they were attributing different things to them, but this would remain physical, in my opinion. However, following the controversion, humanity's focus turned to invisible or non-physical entities to try and explain existence, a process that I call etherealization. This is focusing on the concepts of God, the soul, heaven, as an ethereal existence. You know, and this isn't sort of bad. This isn't necessarily bad, but I think it just went too far. And really, this is, you could say, is the sort of crux of the controversion, is that sort of making things too ethereal, whereby the physical, the astronomical, is sort of pushed to one side. That is my opinion about what the controversion sort of really represents, and, you know, how that differs really from what Astronism is trying to put forward, really. It is asserted that through Astronism's founding, a re-physicalization has occurred, whereby the focus has once again turned to primarily the physical world, specifically the astronomical world, to answer humanity's existential questions. So really, in ancient or prehistoric times, the physical world was also include this sort of physicalization, or this original physicalization, included the terrestrial world primarily. Yes, there was sort of beliefs about the astronomical world, and yes, the astronomical world was involved, but really what was taking place was focuses on the terrestrial world, you know, the animate nature of the terrestrial world. Whereas in Astronism, we don't regard the terrestrial world to have anywhere near as much answers that we do as the astronomical world. What I mean by that is that if we stay on the Earth, that, you know, we will not reach those higher conditions. That's not to say that the Earth doesn't have sort of valuable resources in terms of knowledge and spiritual fulfillment. But what I'm saying, and I'm also not saying that other terrestrial bodies don't have that. And of course they do. When I'm talking about the astronomical world, I am talking about other terrestrial bodies, of course, as well as sort of the physical outer space environment. But essentially what I'm trying to say here is that, for example, if another species from another planet was looking at the Earth, they would have knowledge from us that we could provide to them from the Earth, and they could gain knowledge about the Earth and about life because they've not experienced Earth yet. So that's what I'm essentially trying to say, is that it's because of our perspective here on the Earth, our minuscule perspective, that we cannot see really a higher state of being without sort of engaging with the astronomical world, whether that be spiritually or physically or intellectually. So essentially what I'm trying to say here is that Astronism is really bringing about a re-physicalization process that is making sort of the focus again on physical objects, physical environments, specifically the astronomical world, which includes other terrestrial environments, but excludes sort of the physical environment here on Earth. And of course, I mean, if the Earth had all the answers, which is obviously what some religions imply, or the Earth or humanity including in that, of course, we wouldn't need to go into the astronomical world, would we? If we knew the answers to life and the meaning of life and the sort of answers to all our questions, we wouldn't need to go into the astronomical world, because we would have all our answers set out and ready and ready to go, you know. So we wouldn't need to go into the astronomical world. But because we don't have that, this is why we have to go and undergo transcension in order to get to these higher states of being where we can, understand reality in a new way. So now that we've sort of gone over some of the fundamentals of the Astronist philosophy, we move now into the question of the meaning of life, or life's purpose. This is, of course, one of those questions that I am referring to when I say these existential questions. An endearing yet ever frightening question is one that ponders on the meaning of life. What this question is essentially yearning for is some substantiation that the self and humanity as the collective possess some degree of justification for their existence, that we have a meaning. I mean, of course, there are nihilistic positions, which we're going to look at in a second, which deny any type of meaning at all and sort of reject the sort of presupposition that there is any type of meaning of life at all. The supposition of the question, which is to say, what is the meaning of life? Well, a nihilistic perspective would deny even that presupposition. It would reject the fact that, well, why are you presuming that there has to be a meaning to life? This question of the meaning of life then yearns for the attribution of purpose to human existence. The fact that the question itself highlights its precondition for some life meaning. It wants there to exist a meaning to life, and it is the providing of this purpose that demonstrates one of the core functions of any belief system, whether it be, religious, philosophical, or political or ideological in nature. Any different type of belief system has some degree of meaning of life, whether that is answered directly or indirectly. We also, well, in Astronism, we have sort of this tradition really of, sort of addressing the meaning of life. This is what we call empyreancy. So empyreancy are those Astronist principles that relate to the meaning of life, collectively, in collectivity. So two purposes are identified in empyreancy: purpose as an individual in relation to the self, and purpose as an individual in relation to the collective. So essentially, kind of what that's implying is that humanity itself as a whole doesn't necessarily have a purpose, but it's that your individual self and in relation to the collective provides the purpose, okay? That essentially we go about our lives in individual ways, and when we come together, we have a collective purpose. But if we sort of all humanity as a whole doesn't essentially have, well, according to this purpose here, I sort of dispute this a little bit, not entirely, but it's sort of a different way of putting it across. But it is essentially saying that we do have a collective purpose, but that collective purpose really is centered on the individual self and our sort of our actions really in relation to scope. And again, I'm going to explore this a little bit more when we talk about transcension, and this, what I mean when I'm talking about collective transcension. What I'm essentially saying there is, yes, there is a collective transcension, but it is primarily or entirely sort of focused on this, the precondition of the self, the precondition of the individual as acting in the name of the collective, in sort of the actions of the collective, okay? So empyreancy bases itself on the notion that the astronomical world possesses all facets of life meaning and the capacity for providing life meaning to all humanity. The naturalization of empyreancy means that any notions of the supernatural or preternatural as providing life meaning are removed or are otherwise disregarded, not necessarily by denial of the existence of such entities, but due to the fact that they draw attention away from the astronomical world and its phenomena's capacity for providing life meaning. So what I'm trying to say there is that due to the cosmocentricity of our tradition of life meaning philosophy called empyreancy, a process of naturalization has had to take place, whereby life's meaning is primarily sought through the astronomical world, that rather than primarily sought through sort of any type of divine or supernatural existence, for a number of different reasons, primarily because of the unknowability or the sort of agnostic sort of approach that astronism has with regards to the divine and the supernatural, and the degree of the intervenience of the divine. And again, because of that, we cannot put really too much emphasis on the sort of preternatural or supernatural in providing life meaning, because we're not really sure about the nature of these preternatural or supernatural entities. You know, and whether they're even supernatural is a question. Maybe the better word for us in astronism to use is extra cosmic entities. Maybe we'll have to think about that. So these two types of purposes to life are called extrospectionism and introspectionism. Extrospectionism sees life meaning as out to the individual through phenomena outside of themselves, while the latter sees life meaning manifest from within themselves. So this is really interesting, the idea that, you know, really astronism is partial to extrospectionism, as it sees the purpose of life as harbored within and manifested through the astronomical world. So very much introspectionism is based on sort of New Age philosophy, really, in many ways, sort of New Age religions, this idea that, you know, you as the self, your sort of internal spirituality has this capacity for attaining life meaning. And of course, you know, what the astronomical world is external to the self. So astronism is partial to extrospectionism because the astronomical world is external to the self, and we gain our life meaning from this external source, which is very different from some other philosophies and religions. Spectrum of life purpose. So astronism, cometanism, and all astroncy are diametrically opposed to nihilism, the denial of meaning. Not only is nihilism found to be inapplicable or useless, it is regarded as essentially unfounded, that meaning with or without the existence of humanity would still continue as it relates to either other sapient or sentient beings, or to the functionings of the cosmos as a whole. Astronism, cometanism, and all astroncy find their place in the category of the affirmation of life, alongside both secular humanism and religion. Life purpose for astronism. Essentially, the life purpose, this is where we're getting down to it now. The life purpose for an astronist is to achieve the condition called astrosis. This is a state of being not unlike enlightenment or supreme insight, but specifically with regards to one's personal relations with and their proximity to the astronomical world. The principle of sojournism or sojournism captures this life meaning for astronists in that it states the centrality of the making use of our temporary corporeal existence by our cosmically uniting intellectually, physically, and spiritually. So sojournism is very much influenced by the Astro Naturalist school, or the monocosmist sub-school within Astro Naturalism, which is essentially trying to, make the most of this temporary corporeal existence, but really that is still quite a mainstream astronist understanding. Even in transtellationism, I mean, in most areas of transtellationism, there are recosmism, but in most areas of transtellationism, it is still considered to be linear, so that we're not coming back, that we have one life and that we have this temporary corporeal existence. Yes, there is a post-corporeal existence within transtellationism, but we're not going to return to this corporeal existence. So again, sojournism does still apply to transtellationism, essentially. So, as I've said, empiriancy is astronist principles relating to the purpose of life, and that there are two kind of forms of purpose, really: the purpose of the individual in relation to the self, and the purpose individual in relation to the collective. This is really interesting here. So I spent quite a while trying to gather together all the different approaches to the meaning of life, and I sort of kind of brought together really 6 families of views on the meaning of life. And these families are called nihilism, that we have on the left-hand side there, agnosticism, which we have just one part in from there. We have hedonism and altruism, and then we have astronism and theism. So this is really, really interesting. You know, the different functions here. So obviously at the top there, we've got no meaning, the categories of no meaning, uncertainty of meaning, and then affirmation of some degree of meaning to life. Okay, so we have those really, the no meaning, the uncertainty, and then affirmation. Okay, these are the sort of 3 sort of approaches to the question of the meaning of life. We'll start off with nihilism on the left-hand side, which obviously the other side is, you know, diametrically opposed to. Essentially, nihilism states that there is neither any particular meaning to human life, nor any special purpose to the universe. So what that is essentially saying that neither the individual, nor the collective humanity, nor the universe itself has any particular meaning. You know, that's a very sort of, in a way, quite extreme view, really, to say that there is absolutely no purpose or meaning or higher purpose or higher function or meaning to life. Okay, that's a family of views that we call nihilism. There is lots of other branches within nihilism, 3 of which I've obviously explored here. We've got absurdism, which states that there is a conflict between the human tendency to seek out meaning in a cosmos that objectively possesses no meaning. So what absurdism there is saying, it's holding to its nihilistic principles by stating that, you know, the universe has no objective meaning, but that humanity, we seem to have this tendency to provide meaning, to sort of attribute meaning, to attach meaning to this sort of a universe, despite the universe still having no meaning. Okay, then we have existentialism, which is a very large school of philosophical thought, which essentially in this context relates to the idea that there is no objective meaning to life. So it sort of emerges from sort of an absurdist point of view, but that, so the endeavor turns to creating purpose relative to the individual. So what I'm trying to say there is that, okay, there is no objective meaning to the universe, so like absurdism, but that we can create meaning and that we should create meaning to life through our human capacities for creation and knowledge and sort of inspiration, really. So in a way, even though existentialism is sort of nihilistically, is nihilistic in its sort of derivation, it sort of goes more in the end towards a kind of hedonistic understanding, perhaps. Maybe I should do like a little, I might do like a little bit of a, or maybe I might ruin it, but I was just thinking I might be able to do like an arrow there from existentialism into the hedonism section, because I think existentialism comes to the conclusion that of hedonism, essentially, or a branch of hedonism, essentially, that you essentially can create meaning and that you can do that, and that's fine, even though there is no meaning to life or the universe. So then we also have the school of solipsism, which is that there is no meaning to life because anything external to the mind cannot be sure to exist. Okay, so this is kind of as well going into the uncertainty category in a way, but it is definitely nihilism derived. It is essentially saying that because we are so uncertain of anything existing beyond the self, we cannot really make any assumptions that there is any meaning to life. And so, yes, it's not sort of purely nihilism, but it is definitely a derivation of that. Okay, so we've got this sort of tradition there of, you know, nihilistic understandings to the meaning of life. Then we'll move on to the category called uncertainty, or uncertain approaches to the meaning of life, which is what we call the family of views called agnosticism, which is also used in the context of theistic understandings about, well, discussions about theism. But in this context, it relates to the notion that nothing can be certainly known about the meaning of life due to life itself remaining a mystery. The question of the meaning of life is therefore unanswerable. Okay, so it's kind of agnosticism I don't really like in a way, in this sense, because it sort of leaves it open, doesn't it? It sort of leaves it open that we can't really be sure, and so it's unanswerable. And so, you know, it's kind of annoying, that though, isn't it? It's kind of an annoying approach. It's probably, you know, it could be the right approach. I mean, I don't believe that, but it could be the most logical approach in some ways. You know, to if there's no clear answer, then it's unanswerable, and you just walk away and move on to something else. But I don't really like that approach, really. For me, it's not really my type of approach. And then we have Gnosticism, which I'm using here in relation to the meaning of life as a different, really, word from this sort of Christian sect that it's also used in. And here it relates to the acquisition of more knowledge about the universe as being central in order to answer the question of life, or the meaning of life, and that the meaning of life will come about sometime in the future as a result of this acquisition of knowledge. So Gnosticism sort of has a more, it sort of builds on agnosticism, doesn't it? It sort of builds on this idea that, well, the meaning of life cannot be answered right now, but with sort of more knowledge, we will be able to gain some type of meaning of knowledge, of answer to the meaning of life sometime in the future. And so again, it sort of kind of moves into the affirmation field, doesn't it? But it also kind of leaves it open to a more nihilistic understanding, the idea that if we gain more knowledge, we may realize that there is no meaning to life. So again, Gnosticism could go either way there, couldn't it? It could end up in a sort of no meaning approach or an affirmation of meaning approach. So as you'll see here in the affirmation section, there are two sort of forms of affirmation, really, to the meaning of life. We have the subjective meaning, and then we have the predetermined meaning. I'm going to start with the subjective meaning. So we begin with hedonism, which most of you may already be aware of what this means. It means that the meaning of life is the pursuit of happiness. Simply that. Or the pursuit of pleasure, sorry. And so, of course, you know, that has multiple different applications. It has multiple different understandings and interpretations. And so, you know, and it's very sort of a kind of individual kind of thing. What I want to just do quickly, I'll just move on to altruism just quickly, because I want to kind of contrast the reason. I want to show why I've done sort of a sort of sectioning part there between hedonism and altruism, because I think they're very, very different approaches, even though they're both subjective. So altruism states that selfless concern for the welfare of others, especially when a sense of meaning is derived from pursuing the happiness of others, is the meaning of life, essentially. And again, that sort of it contrasts with hedonism, I think, because hedonism could encompass altruism. I do think hedonism could encompass altruism, in the sense of, if you gain pleasure from helping others and having sort of a selfless concern for others, then you're engaging a hedonistic understanding of the meaning of life. Whereas altruism, I don't always think sort of comes under that, really. Or sometimes hedonism kind of encompasses this connotations that, you know, that the individual pleasure is the most important. And this is why I've included things like egoism, humanism, and materialism under the heading of hedonism there. Whereas I think that more altruism is more about sort of finding meaning in others rather than finding sort of meaning in the self, really. So we'll go back to hedonism for a second and go to egoism, which is hedonism derived, and it relates to the meaning of life as derived from actions that serve the goals of oneself. So you could say that this is a little bit narcissistic, you could go as far to say, in the sense that, you know, egoism is saying that, you know, if you're pursuing the goals of yourself and you're, you know, you're serving yourself, you're pursuing your goals and ambitions, then that's your meaning of life. And that meaning of life is derived through those activities. Again, that you gain pleasure or the pursuit of pleasure through your achievement of your goals and serving your sort of purposes, really, your ambitions. That's what we call egoism. Can you see how this now kind of is moving away from altruism, really, and its derivations and its approaches to the meaning of life? So we've got here humanism. I'm not using humanism in its sort of movement in to relate to the sort of movement of humanism and using it a different way here. I'm relating it to the meaning of life as emerging in the endeavor of the human species to survive and flourish. So it's a little bit about altruism. They kind of mix and match these. That's why I've not created a sort of, you know, you could see there that at the top I've not created a solid partition, but, you know, a main partition, you know, a sort of partial partition. But yeah, humanism here refers to the meaning of life as, you know, the endeavor for the human species to survive and flourish, and sort of contributing to that as a means of gaining pleasure, really. And then we also have materialism. The meaning of life comes from the accumulation of material possessions. This may also be related to consumerism in some regards, or in some definitions. And again, this is related to the pursuit of pleasure. The idea that the more material possessions you have, the more pursuit of pleasure and the more sort of goals and things that you've achieved. And so that is your meaning of life derived from that. Let's now move to altruism again, and we'll go to, I've already explained the main heading there for altruism, so I'll move on to cynicism, which is altruism derived, and it relates to the meaning of life as sort of found in living in virtue, involving the rejection of wealth, power, and fame. So living a sort of simple life, really, not sort of, in a way, not pursuing sort of materialistic understandings of, you know, life and the accumulation of material possessions or power or fame. In a way, cynicism sort of advocates for a more simple life, you know, that the meaning of life is found in the most simplest of things, in helping others, or in the natural world, or you know, just in being content with what you have, in a way. Then we have Stoicism, which is the meaning of life is to secure alleviation from suffering in all ways possible. This is a little bit related to Buddhism, actually, which is interesting, which also has the sort of salvation, really, as sort of intertwined with this idea of the elimination of suffering. Again, this is the elimination of suffering of others and also the individual. Not really related in this sense to hedonism. You could say that pursuit of pleasure is the elimination of suffering, but you could say that they are related. I'm not saying that these aren't sort of mixing together in some ways, and they are definitely interrelated. And then finally, we have veganism, which relates to the meaning of life as coming from helping and protecting animals as fellow sentient beings. This may also include the protection of the environment and the protection of sort of any type of nature or wildlife, or, you know, flowers and things like that, so, or plants. So again, this is very sort of altruistic in many ways, and is sort of, you're gaining your meaning of life from something that is subjective, but it is also something that is not necessarily, it is more selfless in a way. It is quite selfless to care for animals and to, to care for plants and the environment. You don't have to do that, but you're going to do that because that gives you a meaning of life. That gives you pleasure and meaning of life and a sort of, in a way, a selfless concern really for the welfare of others. So finally, here we have the predetermined meaning to life, which is, of course, what I'm most interested in, which is, of course, Astronism being the first one here, which is that the meaning of life is intertwined with our personal and collective exploration of and subsumption into the astronomical world. So people who are familiar with my philosophy should understand that what this means and sort of how, how I'm going about this sort of approach to the meaning of life here. What I'm trying to say is that the astronomical world possesses this meaning to life, and that really our sort of exploration of the astronomical world and our subsumption into the astronomical world, whether that be personal and then later collective, provides us with all the meaning that we need in life. Then we have Astro Naturalism, which is also Astronism derived. This relates to the fulfilling of one's scope, which is, of course, afforded opportunities during life. That is the intrinsic purpose of individual human existence as a means of contributing to the collective transcension of humanity. So essentially what this is saying is that, again, you should use your sort of temporary corporeal existence in order to contribute to the overall transcension of humanity. Okay, and that is your goal, that is your role, and that is what Astro Naturalist approach is. We also have Eleuthonism, which is a sort of separate sort of tradition really within Astronist philosophy, and it relates to the attainment and sustainment of freedom as being the highest moral good and the truest purpose of human life, collectivistic and individualistic purpose. So this idea that, freedom can be related to the collective and to the individual, and it's a very broad topic, it's a very broad applicating topic, but that this has been predetermined for us, that our nature is to want freedom, and that our nature is, to have a tendency to sort of seek freedom, really. We also then have Sapienism, which is that the meaning of human life is derived from the endeavor to discover other intelligent species in the cosmos, resulting in the impartation of truths to humanity. And this is a collectivistic purpose. So this is the idea that, I'm going to contribute to humanity being able to sort of discover extraterrestrial beings. Whether I will be able to see those extraterrestrial beings is another question. And so that makes it a collectivistic purpose. I'm not just doing it for my individual self. I'm not necessarily, I may gain certain benefits in the meantime, but the primary benefit, the primary goal, I won't actually see myself. I won't see that through. I won't benefit from that myself. And so that makes Sapienism in this regard a collectivistic purpose. We also have finally in the astronism category what we call transtellationism, which is intellectual, physical, and spiritual proximity to the astronomical world during one's life, assures the transmigration of one's soul to the stars upon death. This is a very individualistic purpose. So this is basically saying that, if you focus yourself on the proximity to the astronomical world, that you will have a post-corporeal existence among the astronomical world, in death, that you will reach a sort of post-corporeal existence, and that, that you will have really fulfilled your scope. This is a very sort of individualistic approach. Again, you can see here how the Astro Soteriology comes into play here, with transtellation really taking a more sort of personal approach, really, in many ways, to Astro Soteriology, whereas Astro Naturalism generally does take a more sort of a more collectivistic approach in many ways. And then we also have what we call theism here, which is what I've said is the meaning of life is brought about through the actions and decrees of a god or gods. So this is really interesting. So this is bringing a divine or supernatural element that we don't necessarily have in the primary Astronism definition at the top there. Yes, translation, of course, brings in the concepts of spirituality and perhaps divinity, but the primary function of Astronism there at the top is much more naturalistic. Or not dependent upon the spiritual or the mystical, I should say that. So the meaning of life is brought about through the actions and decrees of a god or gods. Asceticism, which is a derivation of theism in this regard, is the meaning of life is found in abstinence from sensual pleasures and one's refrainment from their desires, especially as a means of salvation and spiritual refinement. So again, it's essentially saying that abstinence and sort of, refrainment are a way of reaching higher conditions of the self, and so therefore are able to provide us with the meaning of life in order to get to those higher conditions of the self, to kind of forsake really all that we were talking about in the hedonistic category there, in a sense, for a search for a more mystical side of life. And again, this is manifest in the next approach to meaning of life, which is what we call mysticism in this section, which is that the meaning of life derives from the endeavor to unite with God. So this is a very sort of mystical, spiritual approach to life and life meaning. This is a very sort of finding life meaning through a very much more divine source, supernatural source. And then finally, we have spiritualism, which is gaining access to the spiritual afterlife, gives both context and purpose to corporeal life. Again, very, very interesting conversations taking place here with regards to these different approaches to the meaning of life and how they interact with one another. Of course, spiritualism there is sort of giving a very sort of spiritualistic, post-corporeal emphasis, really, that the afterlife is the most important aspect of life and gives purpose and context to life. And we find that in some religions like Christianity, of course, Islam, less so in some other religions, but definitely in Christianity, we see this type of thing. So this should give you here a sort of overall understanding now of the different approaches to the meaning of life. Of course, I advocate for the Astronism category here as one of the two predetermined approaches to the meaning of life. And of course, you know, there are a shade of really interesting different approaches to the meaning of life here, which is, of course, one of those questions that, you know, one of those primary existential questions that, you know, is possibly, you know, humanity has always been asking since, you know, since we could really think really about sort of different sort of times of existence. So I'm glad now that I've provided this 6 families of views on the meaning of life. So obviously on the previous slide, we were just looking at the different approaches to the question of the meaning of life. Now I just want to go across just some reflections, really, some comments really on that framework that I just introduced to you. The first is that Astronism identifies that absurdism is based on the presupposition that if humans don't provide meaning to something, then it objectively has no meaning. Astronism rejects this by stating that in the scenario of humanity no longer living on the Earth or having even existed ever, the Earth, the Moon, the Sun, and all other entities in the cosmos still possess meaning through the functional courses on which they proceed. So in Astronism, meaning and purpose are not just attributed to human attribution of these, or human application, sorry, of these concepts and sort of ideas, but instead that the Earth, the moon, the astronomical entities, nature itself has objective, very real, very objective, very physical purposes that are very clear in terms of the functions of the cosmos. And so therefore, in a way, what astronomism is trying to do, in therefore directly opposing absurdism, is saying that is trying to remove the idea that purpose and meaning are intertwined with sort of being human, or humanity attributing these concepts and purposes to things. Instead, to say that the cosmos itself, whether humanity exists in the cosmos or not, still possesses purpose. Again, this is astronomism trying to pull back towards a cosmocentric understanding, a cosmocentric worldview, in the sense that, you know, astronomism is trying to say that really, whether humanity exists or not in the cosmos, there still exists objective, concrete, real, physical purposes and meaning in the cosmos. Essentially, astronomism, primarily due to its cosmocentric worldview, does not equate the quality of meaning or purposefulness to human attribution of these qualities. So I'm not going to go over these because I've kind of already explained the different categories, but what you guys can do is you can pause this screen if you wish right now and just take a read of some of these different categories. I'm not going to go through them because we've already sort of explored them on the other slide. So now that we've moved sort of into this realm really of the meaning of life, an important and really at the basis of all empiriancy is the notion that the astronomical world possesses the answers to life meaning. This is one of the most central themes or concepts within astronomism. This notion then is embodied in the doctrine of intracosmism. Intracosmism is its essential premise is that rather than looking for the answers to human existentiality, destiny, and purpose in extracosmic existences and concepts, such as those of God, heaven, and hell, as seen in some other religious traditions, we should instead turn towards the cosmos, which is believed to hold all the comprehensible answers to our ontological and existential questions. Okay, so it's basically saying that really the answers that we crave are actually provided through the astronomical world. And this is what intracosmism is trying to say. Intracosmism does not deny the existence of the divine, nor does intracosmism state that the divine could be feeding or through or intervening, you know, through the cosmos, from sort of an extra cosmic existence and then influencing the course of the cosmos and providing meaning that way. It's not saying that. What it's actually saying is that really primarily we should be looking towards the astronomical world because that is the most knowable, highest condition that we can currently conceive of or interact with. And then from there, we may then be able to begin to look at, you know, interacting on divine levels or supernatural levels or extra cosmic levels once perhaps we've reached the ultimation, for example, just referencing back to the Astro Soteriology there. Really a lot of, so this is in sort of connection to this is the idea of the cosmical journey, really. And it's basically this idea that is at the center of astronist life meaning, that a sort of spiritual, physical or emotional endeavor into the astronomical world, sometimes also called the astral world, is the sort of life purpose of an astronist, is the sort of central goal really of astronist or astronism or astronist belief system. Essentially what this is referring to is the proximity principles that I was talking about earlier on, when I was saying that you know, that the purpose of life for the individual and for the collective humanity is the degree of proximation to the astronomical world. This cosmical journey that we're talking about here is kind of it's relating to this endeavor of proximation. It is relating to this endeavor of subsumption into the astronomical world. Okay, and this is a really kind of a really central fundamental theme really of Astronist philosophy, is this idea of the cosmical journey. We also have here what we call the Cosmocentric Mission. Really, the Astronist mission is to promote cosmocentric thinking, but also as part of Astronist life meaning is, is the fact that every individual astronist should be promoting this concept or worldview of cosmocentrism, getting humanity to think in a way that places the cosmos at the center of all things, places the astronomical world at the center of thought, knowledge, truth, ideas, inspirations, the future, you know, the past, present, and the future. So again, part of the Astronist life mission, life purpose, is to really embark upon this cosmocentric mission, this spreading of the cosmocentric message. So here we're just going to quickly talk about the moral and ethical tradition of Astronism, something that I don't really get to talk about that much, but is an important aspect of Astronist philosophy nevertheless. So a non-moralistic worldview, Astronism is not a moralistic belief system in the sense that its concepts and goals are heavily integrated into a system, heavily integrated into a system of moral codes that must be followed to reach such goals, as is characteristic to the majority of other religions. So what Astronism instead is sort of relies on really is what we call the governing scope of the governing concept, of scope, the opportunity of the present moment and one's self-reflection on the actions or non-actions that one has experienced. So really, this is where the concept of scope comes into it. You know, it's this idea that you have the opportunity to do something, but you also have the opportunity not to do something. And really, this is the primary moral or ethical question or issue within Astronism. What is going to increase my transcension and what is going to decrease it? What is going to move me away from achieving transcension? And what scopes are, should I action in order to do that, and which ones should I not action in my goal to achieve transcension? So, but this is not really a moralistic thing. It's not saying that God will punish you if you don't do these things or if you do these things. It's essentially just saying that you won't achieve transcension. Essentially, that's sort of the main caveat on that, is that that a person who doesn't engage in scope, who chooses the wrong scopes or doesn't action the right scopes, is not going to achieve that highest condition of themselves, and so then that sort of puts them into a sort of a position where really, have they really fulfilled sort of their destiny, really? Have they really fulfilled, their primary purpose in life? This is something they would have to consider as part of that. So, as I've referred to in the screen about the different schools of thought on the meaning of life, really, Astronism's also another primary concern for Astronism is the concept of freedom, really, and the tradition that deals with this is what we call Eleuthonism. Eleuthonism regards freedom as the highest moral aim and the true goal of human life, with its attainment or degree of attainment being the foundation to Astronist ethics. So basically, the Astronist ethical tradition is based on the concept that freedom really is the sort of the goal of all things is a really good thing that we should all try and endeavor to achieve for ourselves and for other individuals. And this is kind of what the Astronist moralistic and ethical tradition is based on, this idea that freedom is good and it's the highest moral good, and that we should really try to achieve it in any way that we can, whether that be for ourselves and for others, you know? So Astronism, as I've said, sees freedom as the ultimate prize, but a distinction is made between personal freedoms and collective freedoms, with the latter often given precedence over the former. This is essentially to say that a person should understand their own personal freedoms as fundamentally intertwined and therefore may need to be limited in order for the freedom of all people to be attained. So this is trying to put your fellow humans in front of yourself in many ways. And this is what Astronism is trying to promote when we talk about freedom and placing the collective freedoms above of just personal freedoms, you know, and that doesn't have to take place in every single instance, but because then you could limit yourself so much that you have absolutely no freedom. But what I'm trying to say there is that, you know, in order to achieve some of these collective freedoms, our own personal freedoms may, to some degree, need to be curbed, need to be put on hold. And so, of course, that isn't the best scenario. We don't want that. We want both personal freedom and collective freedom, totally. But sometimes instances and just life, you know, means that we can't all have, everyone can't all have freedoms, because then we wouldn't have, then we'd be starting to go into anarchy, wouldn't we? We'd start going into anarchism, and that's not a really good way to go. So, you know, this is to say that rules and limitations are sometimes needed to be put in place in order to attain more freedom. For example, just because Astronism sees freedom as fundamentally good does not mean that Astronism regards laws controlling and therefore limiting behavior to be fundamentally bad. Instead, the freedoms that are gained through the laws controlling freedom-limiting activities, such as murder and theft, hold the ultimate goal of attaining as much freedom as possible. I don't think this should be too difficult for people to understand, but this is where Astronism is trying to come from. It's trying to really focus on this concept and theme of freedom. So in Astronism, freedom is seen as an elusive treasure, one that is fragile and vulnerable, and so therefore requires extensive philosophical contemplation to know how to maintain it in different political and personal scenarios. And really part of an astronist's life is trying to gain freedom for oneself and freedom for others in as many instances and as many scenarios as possible. And this really transcends really to many different aspects of life. You know, it sort of permeates into all aspects of life, that essentially means that, you know, as part of an astronist's identity is their advocacy for freedom, really. It is for this reason that Cometan establishes, which is obviously me, the discipline of eleuthyology to discern all aspects of freedom, including primarily its attainment and sustainment, and how we may go about that, and how we may, and how that also relates to, in some ways, the Astro Soteriology, and how we approach transcension, and especially how we approach space expansion, space civilizations, and space exploration, of course. We also have this idea connected, which is called isopanism, which is the idea that all animate beings in existence should be equal due to their animateness, despite differences in sentience or sapience. So what this is trying to say is that, you know, in the previous lecture on astrosoteriology, we kind of made distinctions between sentience, sapience, and I think it was nescience. And basically what I want to try and say here is that I'm not saying that that we as a sapient species are any higher or worth any more, or are worthy of you know, or that sentient species are less so, or are not worthy of equal treatment, or are not worthy of good treatment. What isopanism is trying to say is that all animate beings should be treated equally. regardless of their condition, regardless of their degree of intelligence. So here now we're going to focus on the Astronist Ontology. This is subsection 2 of the broader section on Astronist Philosophy. My unique way, Cometan's unique way. So when we're looking at ontologies of different religions and belief systems, you may come across the term complementarianism. It's a mouthful, but it is a term, and it's one that is particularly associated with Abrahamic religions, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This view states that men and women have different but complementary roles and responsibilities in marriage, family life, and religious leadership. This view has arguably led to the Abrahamic opposition to homosexual relationships and to the exclusion of women from certain roles in society, such as the breadwinner, as becoming the breadwinner or religious leaders. Really what I wanted to do was kind of really remove astronism from this type of way of thinking. And so as time went on and sort of I began to, go into deeper contemplations about this and the, ontology and sort of the nature of human beings and the nature of men and women differently, what I realized was that we're really all very unique, and that this complementarian approach really does not, it's too generalized, it's too general across the different genders and the different roles of people in life, especially for the modern contemporary era. So what I then began to develop, or what began to emerge, was the philosophy of uniquitarianism. So this is sort of really trying to distinguish itself from the complementarian approach. This is colloquially called the unique way. This idea that we are actually all unique ontologically. Essentially, uniquitarianism holds that men and women have unique qualities and responsibilities in society, marriage, family life, religious leadership, and in the world of work, rather than a pre-selected series of roles to which people must then conform to. This is a radically different way of viewing sort of men and women, but also society and beingness. This idea that we are, unique, really, that I am unique and that also you are unique to your own self, and that, yes, that we do share characteristics, we do share certain things, but our lives from the moment of our birth are so unique to us. Our personalities, our environments, the mixtures of people that we've come across, the events that have happened to us, that really we can have some similarities, but to take the complementarian approach and to say that all women require, to be sort of housewives or sort of to be not religious leaders, or that they can't be religious leaders or leaders in thought, really. I mean, already you've seen this with the feminist movement, and so in that sense, uniquitarianism is not new in that sense, but in the sense that it ascribes unique roles and responsibilities and sort of a unique ontology to each individual person. That's where it brings a sort of new dimension really into the conversation. So not only is uniquitarianism established in order to help promote and achieve freedom, but to demonstrate astronism's break from the ontological principles of earlier belief systems, like I've just been speaking about with regards to the Abrahamic faiths. Also, it is thought that the system of complementarianism simply was not up to dealing with the complexities of contemporary society and did not correspond to the needs and ideals of, human life, modern human life. So this is why uniquitarianism has emerged within astronism. Probably what I'm going to do is, I didn't really get much chance to go into much depth with uniquitarianism in this lecture, but what I will do is, in the future, I'll do a separate lecture just on uniquitarianism. So just give me a bit of time and I'll, create a lecture that is, absolutely going to focus kind of like a deep dive really into uniquitarianism. So watch out for that in the coming months, hopefully. So let's move on to the next section now of the Astronist philosophy, which is Cosmos is the only reality. This is connected to ontology, of course. We're still in the realm of ontology, but we're moving now into what we call Cosmotarianism. So this, again, is another tradition within Astronism, another sort of school of thought, or, you know, another tradition of thought within Astronism. But it's quite extreme. It states that the cosmos is the only reality, essentially to say that all that happens at the anthropic or terrestrial level is inferior, both ontologically and kind of in a broader sense, sort of existentially inferior to which occurs at astronomical levels. The Cosmotarian tradition within Astronism developed as a result of the emergence of the worldview of cosmocentrism. And I felt sort of Cosmotarian tendencies, you know, during my career so far. At times, I have felt like going into sort of a more extreme position where, you know, really only the cosmos exists and only the cosmos is the actually reality of existence, rather than sort of this human anthropic reality here. To say that not only does the astronomical world possess importance in the social, psychological, political, and existential experiences of humanity, but fundamentally that it possesses an objective ontological centrality due to the scales at which astronomical progeny and phenomena occur. So what this is trying to say, what Cosmotarianism is essentially doing, is really sort of placing, like I've said there, an ontological centrality on the astronomical world, that the astronomical world is the center of beingness, is the center of kind of the physical reality, really, and that our perspectives here on the earth are so distorted because of our lives and things going on, and our positions on the earth, on this singular planet, that really we are absolutely totally blind to the centrality that is the astronomical world, that is the cosmos. And so that's why Cosmotarianism takes this stance of sort of this idea that the cosmos is the center of reality, really, that we are not the center of reality at all. And again, it kind of, you could say it's kind of like an extreme, more sort of radical form of cosmocentrism, and it does crop up from time to time in the sort of Astronist worldview. So just watch out for that. It's very interesting. You can see when sort of Cosmotarian ways of thinking emerge. So we're now going to move on to what I call the organic cosmos concept. Again, like uniquitarianism, I will do a full lecture on Cosmotarianism at some point and explore it in much more depth than what I've been able to do today. So again, watch out for that in some time in the future. What we call astronomical organicism, or organicism, is based on the sort of broader tradition of organicism, which you know, is a sort of philosophical ontological position. But astronomical or Astronist organicism is itself an organic whole. Sees the cosmos itself as an organic whole, or the astronomical world as an organic whole, distinct from and superior to the terrestrial natural world. So again, we're kind of bringing in a little bit of Cosmotarian ideas here. As such, Astronist organicism makes the distinction between the terrestrial natural world and the astronomical natural world, with the latter holding superiority over the former. So again, then we come to this idea of astronomical authority. This is a really interesting idea, because what it states is that, you know, the astronomical world, the progeny and phenomena of the astronomical world, the moons, the planets, the comets, the stars, all these phenomena have a real physical, concrete superiority over humanity. It's really, really interesting. So kind of in a way, replacing the concept of God really in some religions, or kind of getting between sort of the humans and God, and astronomical comes in the center there, in the middle, between them, to say that before you can even start thinking about, you know, the sort of unknowable nature of the divine or extra cosmic existence, first of all, you need to consider that the astronomical world is our immediate, intimate, immediate authority. You know, for example, if a giant asteroid or comet was hurtling towards the Earth, would we be able to stop that? If it is the course of the cosmos, if it is the course of the astronomical world that we humans are going to die or become extinct from some sort of, you know, huge astronomical event, then we can't really stop that, and we're very powerless to stop that. This is just a very sort of simplistic understanding, or a simplistic example really of the concept of astronomical authority. So now we're going to move into, now that we've finished the Astronist Ontology, again, I've not been able to do too much work on the Astronist Ontology in this lecture, but I definitely will do a lot more work with it later on. I'll probably do a lecture really just on Astronist Ontology, and then I'll probably make separate videos on, you know, the different branches of Astronist Ontology. But essentially what I'm trying to say there is that the main sort of 4 or 5 different branches is uniquitarianism, sort of Astronist organicism, cosmotarianism, and just sort of these ideas about sort of, you know, the idea of astronomical authority really are the central concepts that have emerged in the Astronist Ontology. That doesn't cover all the Astronist Ontology, but covers most of it, I would say. So in this subsection 3, we're now going to move on to what we call the discipline of sentereology. Sentereology is the study of astronality. So astronality we explored right really at the beginning of the first section of this total immersion into astronism during the topic of astrosoteriology. But now we're going to take a look at astronality in relation to Astronist philosophy and sort of the discipline of study that is sentereology. So sentereology, an introduction. Sentereology is the study of human experience of an emotional attachment to the night sky, and how this comes to affect beliefs, practices, and behaviors. Sentereologists therefore study all aspects of astronality, its many forms and levels, which is what we spoke about in the previous lecture, the philosophical discourses underlying it, the empirical study of it, its history, and its role in astronism and in astronist experience and practice and the astronic tradition. Sentereology is often colloquially referred to as astronality theory. So this sentereology discipline really is very, very central to astronism, because astronism is regarded as based on this sort of fundamental emotion really of astronality. And so therefore the study of sentereology really is the study of is really the study of astronist experience of astronality. So an outline of astronality. Let's just go over what we mean by this, because we did it in the previous lecture, but I've not done it in this one. Astronality can be described as a perceptual sort of inherent characteristic of human beings that encompasses all emotional experience as it relates to the night sky, as experienced since prehistoric times. So really astronality is every single person, individual person's experience of a sense of emotional attachment or emotional experience, which then leads on to spiritual perhaps or mystical perhaps experiences, and then also leads on to, in another vein, philosophical, contemplative experiences. In the modern and contemporary context, though, this experience of astronality has broadened to include all emotional experience in relation to the broader astronomical world, not limited to the night sky. So obviously in prehistoric times, they didn't realize that how big the astronomical world is. And so, of course, you know, they didn't realize that there existed galaxies, or that there exists black holes and quasars and all these different types of astronomical phenomena. And so with the modern understanding, thanks to modern astronomy and scientific explorations, we can now say that astronality is broadened out to include all the astronomical world in all its glory and wonder and vastness. So also this is related to astronality experienced in relation to space culture itself, which includes space exploration and space expansion, you know, astronauts and things like that, but also extraterrestrial life and the prospects and consequences of that, as well as rocketry and sort of the space age type of retronism type of sort of experiences of astronality. So astronality has broadened significantly since the prehistoric times, but has also managed to keep that sort of core fundamental theme that is emotional attachment to an experience of astronomical phenomena or space-related phenomena or activity. So how do we enhance them? And this is sort of the question really that was sort of really very fundamental to the founding of Astronism was, okay, we have these experiences of astronality. You know, each person has this experience at varying levels, but you know, if it is a central goal of life to sort of experience this astronality for an astronist, how do we go about enhancing this astronality? How do we go about cultivating and mastering this astronality? And really this formed the basis really of the fundamental sort of goals and purposes of the Astronist belief system. So the personal goal of an astronist is proximity to the astronomical world, something that we call stellancy, which we should know about by now as a merited conferment. So then cultivation of one's emotional attachments to the astronomical world is a necessary precursor to achieving such approximated state, so that we have to, in order to achieve sort of the highest conditions of stellancy that we can possibly achieve, we have to be able to experience and cultivate astronality at higher and higher levels, mastering really this experience in all its different facets and forms and manifestations, really. And the term, what is to refer to this sort of endeavor of cultivation of astronality, is what we call astrology. This is sort of a general intention for an astronist to enhance the astronality, often through engagement with the Astronist belief system, okay? So of course, therefore, astrology can be understood as one of the first steps on one's journey to astrosis, because without the intention to enhance one's astronality, then there exists no hope to become one with the cosmos during one's lifetime. So astrology really is, like I've said, is the first step on the endeavor of personal transcension, really. And again, what sort of astrosoteriology, specifically the collective side of astrosoteriology, is trying to encourage is that all humanity should try to sort of embrace this first step of astrology, this first step of wanting to enhance and cultivate our relations with the astronomical world through our experiences of astronality. So Astronality theory has a couple of different sort of aspects to it. We've got stellanic dualism, we've got wonderness movement, we've got xenoastronality and zooastronality. These sort of aspects we cover in sort of sentereological study. We explore how animals may experience astronality and sort of, you know, what are the consequences of that for the astronist belief system. The prospect of extraterrestrial species experiencing astronality and their traditions of astronality, because of course, you know, because of the unique evolutions of certain species on different planets, they will have traditions of astronality or experiences of astronality that far sort of are different from us. You know, there will be certain similarities, but of course the traditions of astronality will be different, and so we have to consider that, and we do that through what we call xenoastronality. Okay, so there's these different branches of astronality that really explore all aspects and all possible dimensions of astronality. I think I've actually done some of this previously, maybe in the previous lecture, but I will continue. These are just a couple of terminology for astronality. I'm not going to go through those because you can just pause it and read those if you wish. And then we move into what we call meta-astronality, which is is a branch of sentereology, essentially, which essentially explores really the rationale behind sort of astronality, why we consider astronality to be important in astronism. Again, you can take a look and read sort of this. I'm not going to read this extensive bit here on astronality. It's more of an introduction and just going over really what we've already said about astronality, but really kind of meta-astronality is connected to, in many ways, empiriancy, what we were talking about in terms of the purpose of life, connected to the idea that really astronality is central to the meaning of an astronist's life, that experience of astronality, without that, astronism would not exist. And secondly, that, you know, we wouldn't have the capacity to even think about the meaning of life because astronality is so intertwined with our becoming an evolved species, essentially, is what the assertion is from Astronist Theory. And so, you know, an asterism is a physical attribute or personality trait that signifies a person's pursuit of astrosis or their engagement with astronality. And then we also have the stellanic works, which are sort of 7 sort of activities that a person may do in order to improve their stellancy overall. And then we come to just a couple of other theories here. One we call Astronal Essentialism, which is the doctrine that astronality has a set of characteristics that make it what it is, and that it is the goal of the astronist to discover these and to express them in as many ways as possible. I think you should have kind of gathered that by now, that it's sort of the goal of an astronist to cultivate their astronality, to gain knowledge about it, to experience it in different ways. And then we also have subsequentialism, which is the notion that the spiritual and existential elements of astronality are really subsequential to the emotional or psychological elements of astronality. Again, this is trying to bring through this concept of, or trying to sort of reiterate this concept of emotionalism, which is the idea that, you know, at the center of astronism is astronality, and that astronism is based on experience of astronality rather than, you know, the occurrence of any one event or any one concept. Again, subsequentialism is trying to kind of reassert this idea that sort of the emotional sides of astronality are necessary precursors for the spiritual and existential engagements with astronality. We also have dimensions of astronality, which are epistemology, physicality, and pneumality. These explore the intellectual, the physical, and the spiritual engagements with the astronomical world, respectively. And then we also have levels of astronality. So these are exploring, how really that at different levels, astronality can manifest in different ways and have a significant difference on a person's life. I think I've explored these already in the previous lecture, so I'm not going to go into too much depth about these. If you wish to get a refresh on these, you can pause the slide and take a look, or you can go back to my previous lecture on astrofuturology and take a look at a sort of more in-depth where I do a more in-depth discussion of what these 5 levels of astronality manifest as. Here again are some forms of astronality. Again, if you wish to take a look at these, just pause the screen and read them for yourselves. These are just some ideas, meta-astronal ideas, trying to explore really the different types of manifestations of astronality in the world, how different people may engage with astronality at different levels, and in different environments and circumstances. So really, with the development of the concept of astronality and my sort of engagement with astronality at this level, emerged was the discipline of astropsychology, which I redefined, because astropsychology as a term has been associated with sort of astrological psychology, so bringing astrology into psychological treatments and things like that. That's fine, and that exists, and that's okay over there on its own. But in Astronist context, when we use the word astropsychology, we are referring to the not only the psychological experiences of astronists and sort of the psychologies of astronists, but we're also talking really about Noct Calador and more a scientific empirical side of sentereology, essentially. And this really finds its basis in the work of William E. Kelly and Donald Daughtry, who are American psychologists who have been exploring the concept of, or the psychological construct, that should say psychological construct, not psychological constructed. Apologies there. They've been exploring this since 2003, so almost 20 years now. And so, what they found is that Noct Calador facilitates human behaviors in different ways. So it really allows a person to, or encourages a person, or sort of is correlated with people who have a propensity to engage in fantasy and have a propensity to engage in sort of new ideas, really strange, perhaps new ideas, quirky ideas, perhaps. And so I mean, yeah, you can understand that, because a lot of what when we look up at the night sky, the connotations that we have is that we think about the future, we think about weird, strange, and wonderful things that are kind of, beyond us, as beyond our thoughts, beyond our imaginations in many ways, beyond us in just that really basic existential way. So of course, people who engage in sort of Noct Calador thinking, they're going to have a propensity for kind of being attracted to these types of concepts and experiences. So there are sort of 3 major approaches really to, Cometanic theories. So my theories on Noct Calador. First of all, we've got absorptivism. So absorptivism states the instance in which a person, especially one with a propensity for Noct Calador, experiences a sense of absorption into the night sky, with some extreme cases causing trance-like states described as astral ecstasies. You may have seen me either in these lectures or in Interviews talk about astral ecstasies. This is where these astral ecstasies are coming from. They're coming from this absorptive, or we sometimes call it subsumptive, experiences with the night sky. Then we've also got attachmentism, which is a person's consideration of the night sky as an attachment object due to a variety of reasons, really. It can be a sense of safety and security, but also a sense of life meaning, like we were talking about earlier in this lecture, but also in the sense of, it can provide sort of a quiet place, a place of reflection, a place of getting away from the noise of the world, really, connecting with nature, but connecting with a form of nature that is sort of beyond us, that is transcendent, is astronomical in scale rather than just terrestrial in scale. So that's attachmentism. And then we've also got connectivism, which is the instance and nature of a person's capacity to feel an association with or relation or link to the astronomical world. So the connectivism denotes sort of a person's sense of astronality and the degree to which, or capacity to which, they may feel that and associate with that, especially in the context of empirical studies. So being able to empirically explore a person's capacity to feel these, this emotion of astronality or not calidor. We also have two other ideas here, which are what we call extrospection, which is the examination of the external world for existential comfort rather than searching within the self. This was referred to previously in this lecture today when I was talking about the meaning of life and how in Astronism we focus on extrospectionism, the idea that something external to the self provides the sense of meaning and purpose and life meaning, essentially, rather than just looking inward to the self to provide that. And then we also have this interesting idea of noctilism, which is the astronist attempt to change the concept that darkness and nighttime are bad or dangerous. This is essentially formed on the idea that, when it's nighttime, our visibility is reduced, and so therefore, as humans, as sort of animals, we have adapted to become more cautious at night. We become more aware of our surroundings, perhaps, at night. Our senses are heightened at night because we associate nighttime with danger essentially with bad things taking place. So what we want to try and do in astronism is to try and reduce that. Not to say that you shouldn't be wary when you're walking home on your own at night, but what we're trying to say is we're trying to remove that sort of negative connotation with the nighttime, with the night sky. Really, noctilism is associated more with what we call noctism, which is a branch or sort of a sect within astronism that live their lifestyle according to the night sky. So they sleep during most of the day, and then are active at night, essentially. So that's what we call noctism. Noctilism isn't always associated with noctism, but it's sort of leading into that. It's sort of the first sort of principle of noctism, essentially. Here again are some more Cometanic theories on Noct Calidor. We have permeability, the degree to which external stimuli come to affect one's perceptions and behaviors. So in astropsychology, permeability is applied in reference to a person's propensity to experience Noct Calidor, the permeation of the astronomical world as an external stimuli with effect on behavior and perception. So again, this is kind of talking about the degree of a person's propensity to experience Noct Calidor, essentially. Regulationism is the concept that the night sky can act as a stimulus for regulating the psyche in some individuals. Certainly, I feel like this is me. I feel like the night sky has that very regulatory aspect for me. I think that's definitely associated with my astral disposition. And then also, again, this is another thing that I've found really helpful, is what we call sidereal therapy or therapeutic astronomy, which is essentially the engagement with sort of night sky activities such as stargazing and other astronomical activities as a way, as a therapeutic treatment, as a therapy goal, or as a therapy treatment. Basically, it's sort of based on this idea that the night sky has, you know, sort of, what's the word? It has kind of capacities that are able to, that it is able to provide, such as relaxation, just a sense of quietude, a sense of getting away from the noise of the world, reconnecting with nature in many ways, being just silent and just observing the astronomical world, essentially. So sidereal therapy has many different aspects, many different things. And I think really, as time goes on, this therapy, I really want to try and influence and try and develop more and try and get psychologists behind on sort of applying this therapy, because I think it will lead into persons sort of engaging with their astronalities a little bit more, which obviously I'm going to always promote, you know. Wow, there's a lot of concepts here. Apologies for all these, but I just want to get through them all because I think they're all really, really interesting and very important. We've got this idea of cosmos connectedness, the degree to which an individual includes the astronomical world or space exploration as part of their identity. This is really connected to astronist, the concept of an astronist, you know, this idea that the astronomical world is intertwined, that astronality is intertwined with you know, a person's identity and their self-concept and how other people see them. Connectedness to cosmos scale, so this measures an individual's degree of connection to the astronomical world, so essentially their degree of experience of astronality and not Calidor. We've also got nyctophilia hypothesis, which is the assertion that humans possess an innate tendency to seek connections with the astronomical world. Again, in Astronist soteriology, we attribute this sort of tendency to the event of the scope of man during the Upper Paleolithic period. And then also we have this idea of place attachment. So this idea of a person can achieve an emotional bond with a place, not just another person, not just an object, but an actual place. And that the astronomical world, that the astronomical environment is certainly an environment that this type of place attachment can occur in. So now that we've covered sort of sentereology and we've explored astronality and its various different concepts and sort of my approaches to the, or contributions really to the work of William E. Kelly, etc., on Not Calidor, we now move into subsection 4, which looks at Astronist theory, okay? So Astronist theory is essentially at the basis of much of what I've talked about already. And it's really the extension of the Astronist belief system into theoretical, fictional, or philosophical discourses. So essentially what that means is that you've got the Astronist belief system here, which is a set of beliefs, a set of concepts, and that these exist, okay, and then Astronist theory is relating these beliefs, concepts, and structures of the Astronist system to discourses in order to create discourses, really. So an example of this, of Astronist theory at work, is the idea of the scope of man relating to the evolution of humanity. That is an example of Astronist theory taking a concept or belief from the Astronist system and extending that into a philosophical discourse, okay? Or even into a scientific discourse. So essentially, Astronist theory is the sort of basis really of all the different discussions and discourses that we have in astronism, because without Astronist theory pulling out these concepts and exploring them and extending them into different discourses, we wouldn't have the sort of richness that astronism has become. So as we carry on in the history of astronism, Astronist theory will continue, of course, in this endeavor. It will continue in this function. And of course, what we call Cometanic theory is the sort of specific discourses produced directly by myself and also the related scholarly works. An example of which is the Astronic tradition. An example of that is the Astronic tradition. So we also have on this slide 3 more branches, which is characteristics theory. You can take a look at what that reads there. Just pause it and take a look what that says. We've got the philosophy of space exploration, which is a sort of broader philosophical discourse about space exploration more broadly. Sometimes we might bring an astronist perspective into it, but generally that is kind of referring to a sort of non-bias exploration of space exploration exploration of space exploration, yeah. You know, and just kind of exploring sort of the nature, functions and purposes of you know, the humanic exploration of the cosmos, and sort of how, you know, that may relate to you know, different philosophical discourses, essentially. And then finally on this slide we have truncation theory, which is all about sort of how the scheduling it's kind of related to the activities of the Astronist Institution, essentially, that scheduling 3-year periods into the future is a significant, or is a good approach to take for the Astronist Institution's activities. So that's really not that related to Astronist philosophy that much, but it is part of Astronist theory. So now that we've sort of looked at some of the different branches of Astronist theory, we can now take a look at a branch that I've not mentioned yet, which is conceptual theory. So in conceptual theory, we study all the different types of concepts, essentially. These are some of them that I've listed here. We've got belief orientation, a conceptual, an instrument of study, a dogma, a subject of dogma, or a peremptory, which is I've missed off that there. What I should have put is a type of subject that sort of requires incontrovertible truth, essentially, demands to be incontrovertible in order for the astronist belief system to function, is essentially what I try and say there. Whereas a doctrine is something that can be made into a sort of a subject that is, or a belief that is subject to sort of faith to some degree, but is not actually incontrovertible, that it is interpretable, essentially. So an example of a dogma in astronism is one that we've already looked at already, which is transcension. In order for the astronist belief system to exist at all, there has to be the concept of transcension. There has to be this idea that the astronomical world really is essentially the fundamental source of salvation and sort of helping humanity reach this higher condition, which can be interpreted obviously as a form of salvation, and it is so in astronism. So I'll just write that down now. Then we come to the different orientations. We've spoken already about extrospectionism, introspectionism, and sojournism. So I'm not going to go over these again, but these are just examples really of how astronist theory is able to explore a concept such as the meaning of life, pull out sort of concepts from that subject, and then have sort of discourses really about those concepts. So for example, the meaning of life subject is made into a discourse by astronist theory by the idea that existential questions can be found or answered outside of the self. And so then this opens up a discourse to, well, is that true? To what degree is that true? Do we have any evidence for that? Is there any empirical evidence? Is this more based on faith and just sort of as part of a belief system? What does all that mean? So this is just examples of how Astronist theory can really bring about discourses, essentially. So now that we've just spoke a little bit about Astronist theory, I've not really been able to go into too much depth with it because I wanted to do more about there's lots of different concepts that are part of Astronist theory that relate also to meta-astronism, but you know, I couldn't fit everything into this total immersion, so I'm going to address sort of Astronist theory in a separate video, essentially, in a separate presentation. So now that we've done that, we can move on to subsection 5, which refers to the knowledge sources of Astronism. So the central concept really when we're looking at the Astronist epistemology is what we call afflation. This is the central concept for knowledge sources in Astronism. And it essentially relates to the summation of really my experiences from the age of 15 that led to my founding of Astronism, but also describes experiences of persons called etherists throughout history. Afflation is the disclosure of knowledge, foresight, and truth by means of connection to the astronomical world, by means of intense contemplations, ecstasies, indices, or celestial modes, which then lead to innate impulses and sometimes also preternatural abilities. So when I'm talking to you guys about my astral ecstasies and indices and my celestial modes that I went throughout this founding era, throughout the development of astronism so far, what I'm referring to, the sort of epistemological foundations of that is what we call afflation. So essentially afflation is the derivation of knowledge from the astronomical world. And by a receptor, which is a person who then forms receptions and then puts those out there to the public, to the people of the world, essentially. So afflation, just overall, is the disclosure of knowledge, sometimes also foresight and truth, but not always. Sometimes it's just knowledge from the astronomical world, essentially. That's what afflation is. And so that highlights how the astronomical world is the source of knowledge in astronism. So it's not only the source of salvation, it's not only the source of existential meaning and purpose, as we've explored in this video, but it's also the source of knowledge, okay, in astronism. So moving on really with afflation a little bit more, afflation forms the basis of the category of inspired religions, of which astronism is a member. Thus, it is contrasted with revelation and the revealed religions. And the reason why I've put afflation there again is I've wanted to reiterate this idea that afflation is really, it is not a form of revelation. It is a different type of knowledge derivation in a sense. It is inspiration at the fundamental level. It is a person who has experienced astronality at a level where they receive knowledge, whether that be from something divine. There is not, you could add that as a belief into afflation, but astronism generally doesn't. It leaves that open to interpretation. But the fundamental process that has taken place is that a person who looks up at the night sky and then has an idea, there is a process that has taken place there, and we call that process afflation, okay? And that is different from revelation. Generally in revelation or in revealed religions, a supernatural entity such as an angel, for example, in Islam, or God himself, obviously in Christianity, appears or comes down from heaven or appears somewhere and imparts knowledge. This is a different process. Afflation is a different process altogether, and it kind of forms the basis of what we call the inspired religions, in contrast, of course, to the revealed religions. The preternatural does not correspond to the supernatural in Astronism. Although we may use these terms interchangeably, preternatural refers to something that is maybe not normal, that is not achievable for all people, but is certainly not necessarily unnatural or supernatural. It may not be attainable for all people, such as surrography. Surrography is an example. Surrography is the capacity for a person to write at extensive lengths. So the Omnidoxy has been attributed the category of being a surographical text because of its extensive length. And other texts in Astronism have also been ascribed this category, this term. Not every person can write to those extensive lengths. So that would be an example of a preternatural skill or ability or phenomena. So it's not unnatural. It's not walking on water, for example. It's not supernatural, but it is preternatural. It is, it's beyond the normal. It's beyond the mundane in some respects. It is beyond what the average person may be able to conceive of, produce, or understand. Really essential to the Astronist epistemology is what we call ternorism. Ternorism is the assertion of the existence of three sources of knowledge in Astronism regarding the astronomical world as either the intermediary of the year source of all knowledge, or as being the actual year source of all knowledge. We talked about the year source right at the beginning of the original lecture on astrosoteriology of this total immersion. So take a look back there if you wish to know more about that. And we'll also be looking at the year source later on, I think, as well. But essentially, the year source describes whatever is the ultimate sort of source of knowledge, really. What is the ultimate source of kind of existence in some ways, but mainly we refer to knowledge in this particular context. These three forms of discovery, within ternorism are discovery by space exploration and space expansion, reception and inspiration, regarded as knowledge through divinical, intellectual, or mystical experience, and then observation, regarded as knowledge through scientific experimentation and empirical research. So these three sort of forms of knowledge within Astronism contribute to the overall sort of knowledge basis of Astronism, that what we know about the astronomical world through Astronism, what we know about how ways that we can interact with the astronomical world through Astronism, and the ways that we can derive knowledge, possibly truth, foresight in some ways from the astronomical world, essentially, is what ternorism is saying there. So here's a slide about the year source. So the year source is the original source of knowledge regarded by some astronists as the astronomical world. Of course, in astrotheism, all knowledge is regarded as intermediated by the cosmos, but that all knowledge emanates from an ultimate extra-cosmic source, obviously conceptualized in Astronism as the divine. That's what distinguishes sort of astrotheism from sort of general astronism. Generally in Astronism, there is not the presupposition of the role of the divine. Okay, that doesn't mean that Astronism rejects theism or rejects astrotheism. It just says that Astronism, the concepts of Astronism, generally don't presuppose that. Whereas in astrotheism, what it does is lays a kind of veil over Astronism, a kind of layer, a new layer over Astronism that interprets everything in relation to the divine, in relation to sort of a supernatural or a godly entity. So that's how sort of astrotheism kind of is in a way is kind of an approach to astronism that incorporates all concepts within astronism and relates them to a higher power, essentially. So here is a section on Astronist Philosophy of Religion. I'm not going to go into too much depth about this because the Astronist Philosophy of Religion is really, really extensive, and it would take over this whole lecture if I did do that. But what I'm going to do is just provide sort of an overview, really, of the Astronist Philosophy of Religion, what these branches and theories and concepts of the Astronist Philosophy of Religion attempt to do is to sort of understand the dynamics and functions of religion, sociologically, psychologically, archaeologically, politically, and in many other different facets. Really, the development of astronism in the last 8 years has come from, in some ways, my exploration of the philosophy of religion, because in many ways, some of the unique concepts within astronism have been developed in direct contradistinction to the existing concepts of other religions. So that's why, you know, the Astronist Philosophy of Religion is really important, because in sort of identifying the structures and foundations of other belief systems, astronism is then able to sort of make its own decisions in a way to try and say, well, what are we? Are we with these groups, or are we on our own? Are we separate? Are we going to be new or different? So it's a really important discipline that kind of leads on to many different new topics in a way. So during astronism's development, it was natural that I would receive ideations that pertain to the nature of religion, because astronism is in effect a new religion. Engaging with theories on religion allowed astronism to emerge into the unique form that it has, because in understanding the dynamics of pre-existing systems allowed for the development of the Astronist system. So I've just explained this there on the previous slide. Therefore, a number of theories, terms, and concepts have emerged of cometanic origin to deal with or otherwise address the many different dimensions of religious behavior in its many forms. So here we have just some major branches of the Astronist Philosophy of Religion, specifically my theories on Astronist Philosophy of Religion, really. We've got the actions of religion, we've got Astronist origins of religion theory, which it is connected to astronality and is connected to the scope of man, and is also connected to the development of the astronic tradition. We've also got, on the right-hand side there, we've got ethnotheology, we've got meta-religions. So meta-religion explores the ideas of what functions does religion possess in society, what sort of purpose does religion have in society, processes of religion, sentimentology, worldview theory, and many others. I've just provided these to show you the sort of breadth of this discipline, really. There's a lot that it encompasses, and so there's a really rich tradition, really, of the philosophy of religion within astronism. So here we come to what we call the Astro Futurology. So this is going to explore, in subsection 7 here, the sort of astronist understandings of the future, but also astronist understandings in some ways of the past. First of all, we come to what we call astrolution. So astrolution is a sort of merging together of the words astronism and evolution, of course. And what this is basically saying is that astrolution is the physiological and psychological evolutionary changes that are predicted to take place in regards to human beings and other species as a direct result of space exploration. So what astrolution refers to is the evolutionary changes that will take place due to space exploration, human space expansion, human space activity, and also human civilizations on other planets, okay? Also, I should have put in there intellectually as well, not just psychologically and physiologically, but also intellectually, spiritually perhaps as well, mystically, those mystical changes. But generally, psychological and physiological refers to those evolutionary changes. Astrolutionism is the related belief orientation that space exploration, and particularly the colonization of worlds other than the Earth, will inevitably cause accelerated evolution among human beings. So, of course, this is saying that space exploration is going to be the key driver of evolution in the future. And this is a really big topic to sort of unpick and explore, obviously, at a later date. But I think this is really important as well to the Astro Futurology and also to the Astro Soteriology, because these disciplines are placing such importance on the astronomical world and space exploration. What Astrolutionism does, it brings it down to a kind of scientific basis, saying that, yes, there is inevitably going to be evolutionary changes that take place for human beings or any other sapient species that explores the stars as a result of, you know, the colonization of these worlds. So Astrolution is something that I probably will do an entirely separate lecture on at some point in the future. We've also got contiguence. Contiguence is the notion that the humanic exploration of the cosmos need not be definite to occur, or is not definite to occur, and that certain occurrences must be secured unless the exploration shall not occur. So contiguence is basically saying that, yes, it's kind of connected to the Twilight-eyed crossroads that we spoke about in the Astro Soteriology in the previous lecture, where, you know, I was talking about how, you know, there are two choices, and if we go from one choice to another, if we choose Vesperia, then we will be able to attain transcension, and if we choose Evenfall, then we will go into the degradation. This is kind of talking about that, but it's sort of kind of a broader non-soteriological way. So contiguence really explores the idea of what needs to happen. What needs to happen for the humanic exploration of the cosmos to happen? Essentially, contiguence is based on this idea that space exploration is not definite to occur, and that, yes, there are certain contingent factors that will affect human exploration of space that need to be sorted out, that need to be ironed out, that need to be addressed by Astronist philosophy and the broader world before space exploration can take place. You may have noticed before I mentioned semontology, or maybe I didn't mention semontology. I'll have to go back and have a look at it. But semontology or semontonomy is the particular set of beliefs of a person in relation to sort of possessing a higher existential meaning. And so semontology really is the study of higher meaning, really, in relation to, but not always, but primarily in relation to outer space, of course, for astronism. So transpersonalism, differently, is the Astronist philosophical assertion that there does exist a higher meaning and purpose to the evolution and present sentient existence of humanity, one that extends far beyond the mere existence of personal identity. So what we're trying to say here is we're kind of linking this to the scope of man in many ways. This is sort of the philosophical basis of the scope of man, because what this is trying to say is that there certainly is some type of higher meaning for humanity, and that, you know, as a result of our evolution, we have sort of this opportunity or this scope to, you know, extend ourselves to much higher levels of being than what we would have been able to otherwise if our evolution had not occurred. So what semontology deals with is meaning, but particularly sort of higher existential meaning in relation to the person or humanity as a whole, and especially in regards to the astronomical world. Previously, I think in the previous lecture, on the Astro Soteriology, I explored futurocentrism. Futurocentrism, of course, is the worldview that is the Astronist worldview that places, a focus on the events of the future times, the future existence of humanity, but also the future existence of the cosmos. I feel that my worldview, certainly, because it is cosmocentric, oftentimes it is also futurocentric, because I'm thinking always about the future. I'm thinking always about how humanity is going to better itself, is going to attain higher conditions, is going to, take opportunities, take action scope, and all these different things. So yes, my worldview is certainly oriented on the future. And again, this comes from the Astronist philosophy of religion in a way, where you can kind of compare Astronism in this sense to Buddhism and Christianity. Buddhism is often presented or understood to be, rooted in the present moment, focused on the present, living life in the present moment rather than thinking about the future or the past. Whereas Christianity, a lot, is whether Christianity wishes to admit this or not, is very much about the past. It's very much about events having occurred in the past and how those events occurred, whether they occurred. These types of things are very past orientated. And similar again as well for Abrahamic religions. You could say Judaism is a little bit more futurocentric because it's focused on this idea that the Messiah is yet to come. And so they look towards the future. So Judaism is a little bit different, but I would say that definitely Islam and Christianity are sort of very sort of past orientated or oriented. Whereas Buddhism is more present orientated, and then Astronism is much more future orientated, and so is Judaism. We have this idea of Torakianism. Sorry for all these terms and everything, but there's just so much to get through, and I want to really, capture it all as much as I can best in this, in this lecture. So Torakianism is the belief in the imminent end of humanity, or the implosion of human civilization as a result of an inadequate process in the endeavor to settle worlds other than the Earth. Essentially, inadequate process in the endeavor of transcension, essentially. There are many Torakians, I know them, quite a few actually, and they're very interesting people. I mean, they have a very different way of looking at the future, especially the immediate future for humanity. They kind of have a very kind of pessimistic view of humanity at the moment, and also have a very sort of, in some ways they have a pessimistic view, but then in other ways they don't. The ways that they have a pessimistic view is that humanity is going to implode or is going to, end or go extinct if we don't get to the right or a certain level of transcension before a certain time. Whereas they're also quite positive in the sense that humanity has the capacity to do this now. We're just choosing not to, is what the Torakians generally would say. So again, it's kind of like a current within Astronism. It's like a theme or tradition of thought within Astronism. Very interesting. I'm not going to go over too much Astronist prophecy because I've not gotten really enough time in this lecture to really give it the sort of the meat that it needs, the meat that it deserves, the meat on the bone that it deserves. There's a heck of a lot that comes as part of Astronist prophecy that in many ways is pushing forward the Astro Soteriology. But here are just some sort of inklings of some examples. But what I will do, I'll probably do a lecture on Astro Futurology as a whole, just, specifically Astro Futurology, and then Astronist prophecy will be within that, or just a whole separate lecture on Astronist philosophy. So in the previous subsection, in the previous lecture, I spoke about proto-anthropology as dealing with the first things, in contrast with eschatology, which deals with the last things. So proto-anthropology is the astronist discipline that covers anything that deals with the first of things in relation to the astronomical world and space exploration and also humanity. So an astroanthropologist studies sort of aspects of the scope of man, conditions of the human species, sidereonomy, and beliefs related to the first things of humankind. Examples of which include, for example, the first experience of astronality, the first experience of, the first time that a person actually engaged with stellancy, the first human to live on another planet, for example, would be a futurological concept within proto-anthropology. Again, here are just some aspects that you can take a look at. Pause the screen if you wish to take a look at these. Again, there's so much within proto-anthropology that I just don't have the capacity at the moment to delve into enough in this lecture. There's just not enough slides. There is not enough time in this one lecture to do that, but I've given you 5 different examples here of just different aspects really of what proto-anthropological study deals with. Here's a further 4 different aspects as well. Just pause the screen, take a look, and really try and just read them one at a time. Just read them one at a time, and really try and take in what I'm trying to say here, and try and relate it to the Astro Soteriology as well, because proto-anthropology is important to the Astro Soteriology. So now, as we come to the end of this lecture on Astronist philosophy, what I will do is read out the 12 essences of Astronist philosophy. Just as I did for the Astro Futurology, there exists 12 sort of statements really that provide sort of a logical framework. They provide sort of a logical sequence in a way for the beliefs of fundamental principles of Astronist philosophy, and these 12 essences are the same type of thing. So I'm going to read these out, and then I'll do some concluding notes, and then I'll be seeing you in the next episode. So essence number 1. Because outer space is seen as the primary existential source in astronism, Astronist philosophy focuses on guiding individuals and humanity as a whole in cultivating a stronger and purer relationship with the stars. Number 2. Astronist philosophy teaches individuals to live in close proximity to the astronomical world in terms of thought, belief, and practice, so as to assure the resolutions that astrosis brings. Hence, the life purpose of a practicing astronist is to live, work, and generally be in a way that leads to this highest condition of themselves as a kind of personal sort of transcension or saving of the self. Empyreancy is established as the astronist tradition of exploring the question of the meaning of life, with astronism asserting ample purposes to both individual and collective human existence, centered on a spatial theme, therefore fundamentally rejecting the doctrine of nihilism. That was essence number 3. Essence number 4. Astronism asserts a form of life purpose that places an all emphasis on that which is external to the self, a belief that we call extrospectionism, specifically towards the natural extraterrestrial environment or the astronomical world. A place regarded as having provided humankind with meaning since prehistoric times, a tradition that has seen a decline, but that I hope to or seek to revive. Essence number 5 of Astronist philosophy is that in the philosophical sense then, Astronism, with a lowercase, is the doctrine that the meaning of life, and by extension, both personal and collective salvation, are provided through the emotional functions of the night sky and by way of the prospects of outer space, especially its physical and philosophical exploration. Okay. Number 6 essence of Astronist philosophy in its prioritization, of the importance of the astronomical world, Astronism detracts from the philosophies of humanism, materialism, and hedonism, yet without necessarily resorting to spiritualism to provide answers to pressing existential questions. That's a really important one to just consider. Just think as I going through these, just think about what these each logical steps of Astronist philosophy is saying, okay? Then we have number 7 essence, which is that I have established a new type of belief system called astroncy in order to categorize those philosophies which place a central focus on outer space as the means by which higher conditions of knowledge, self-understanding, and experience may be sought and reached. Obviously, that's what I'm referring to there as transcension, or in other words, in a more sort of religious sense, salvation. Number 8 essence of Astronist philosophy. Astronism prizes freedom above all else, a principle called eleuthonism, which pertains to one's own freedoms as well as those of others. This is because freedom is seen as integral to the process of potentialization in the astrosoteriology. And so the principal moral question and determiner of ethicality in astronism is the degree to which, or whether at all, an act inhibits freedom, either one's own or someone or something else's. Here we come to number 9 essence of Astronist philosophy. Essentially, Astronist philosophy focuses on fulfilling one's potential as a means of saving themselves. This entails acting on scope, the opportunity of the present moment, as a means of attaining one's highest possible condition, called astrosis. Number 10 essence of Astronist philosophy. Scope is the governing concept of all astronism, as it embodies all of those opportunities presented to us during our lives. Astronist philosophy encourages astronists to fulfill their potential in their familial, professional, and contemplative lives, hence establishing a scopic paradigm, which is conceptualized as encompassing the aforementioned moral one. Number 11 essence of Astronist philosophy. Astronist theory extends human observations of the night sky and space exploration into cultural discourses, namely to discern how these activities since prehistoric times have come to affect the human psyche, religious belief, and society as a whole. And then finally, number 12, we come to Astronist philosophy as seeing the human past, present, and future as inextricably intertwined with the progeny and phenomena of the astronomical world, with its entire futurology oriented on human interactions with and in outer space. So there you have it, people. There is the 12 essences of Astronist philosophy. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of a conversation with Cometan. At the end of this section now, I'm going to finish this Astronist philosophy section of this episode. What will be added on to the end of this episode next is a section that will deal with the designation of astronism, the issue of the designation of the Astronist belief system and philosophy, but it's not a full episode in and of itself, so I'm going to add it to the end of this Astronist philosophy episode, but I just hope that you've sort of captured these 12 essences really and can sort of begin to in a way can begin to absorb what I'm trying to say. Of course, you know, as astronism develops, as I develop, I'm going to get better at being able to explain Astronist philosophy. I'm going to get sharper at explaining it and sort of more concise and more clearer as time goes on, I hope. So I hope that you'll bear with me when I, you know, sometimes I stumble over words and, you know, sometimes I get confused and sometimes, you know, I've sort of missed things out, and I know that, you know, I'm going to get better as time goes on, but I just need that sort of time and experience really to do that opportunity, that scope, to get better at doing these types of lectures and presentations, you know, and hopefully by the time, you know, that I'm getting into sort of my 30s and 40s, certainly, you know, I'll have much more experience and be able to explain astronism in a way that is really, really compelling. But I hope that this explanation of the Astronist philosophy has still been compelling, and I will see you in the next section of this lecture episode of a conversation with Cometan, where I will be discussing the designation of astronism, or the issue of the designation of astronism. So now let's move on to the third section here, just at the end of episode 8. I just quickly want to go through what I've described as the issue of the designation of astronism. And the reason why I call it the issue is because the sort of process of defining and designating what astronism is and describing what astronism is a lengthy one. It is a difficult endeavor to sort of overcome, really. And I think it's one that's going to continue to evolve as astronism evolves. And it's not an easy area to deal with, because there's a lot of moving parts with astronism, and it's not always clear which aspects of astronism should be emphasized over others, especially when you're trying to write really short, concise definitions, or even trying to designate astronism. So first of all, we're going to focus on the defining astronism problem here in section 1. So, you know, I've given a definition here that is, you could say, the broadest possible definition of astronism without losing the sort of thematic and characteristics and you know, that make astronism what it is. So astronism is the consideration of the astronomical world as the source of human salvation, existentiality, and meaning or purpose, a consequence of which is the cosmocentric worldview. Okay. Then we have what we call Cometanism, which is the sum total dispensations of the personage of my personage and my resulting philosophy. So astronism as founded and presented by Cometan. So this is astronism as presented and as founded and presented by me, in terms of how I see what astronism should be, how I see what astronism could and should be in my perspective. That does not always correspond with institutional astronism, and it doesn't always correspond with, and it definitely does not always correspond with sort of general astronism and sort of different interpretations of astronism from, you know, other individuals or past individuals. Then we have what we call institutionalism, which is a select and organized form of the large range of beliefs and practices that come to form astronism. So essentially what this is what we call orthodox astronism, or Astronist orthodoxy. This is sort of, again, another term is institutional astronism. This is an organized form of the Astronist belief system, a highly organized form that is, you know, promulgated, presented in a particular way, and by the institution, and is sort of available for the public to explore and engage with in that way. So essentially, what I'm trying to say here by exploring these different definitions is that, you know, even just with these definitions, there are, in a way, countless sort of interpretations and different ways of presenting astronism, depending on what you want to focus on. So you could have like a thematic definition, which focuses maybe on the soteriological aspects of astronism, or another type of thematic definition is focusing on the theological aspects of astronism. What we call a functional definition is where sort of a function of astronism is emphasized. So astronism helps people engage with the astronomical world in a different way, kind of intellectually, spiritually, and also sort of like in a mystical way as well. So, and in an emotional way, of course, as well. So a functional definition is really focused on the ideas of what does astronism do, rather than particularly what it is. The way that astronism is defined is how it functions. Okay, and then you have sort of what we might call standard definitions, which is where sort of a belief about, or the worldview of astronism, or the origins of astronism are focused on. So that an example of that would be astronism is a belief, is an astronic belief system founded by Cometan in 2013. So what I mean by that, obviously that is focusing on the designation, the classification of astronism, which is part of the astronic tradition. Then it's focusing on when astronism was founded, its classification as a belief system, and who founded it, me. So that is what we might call a standard. We might call that a standard definition, or a standardized definition. Sometimes we might call that. There are other terms for that as well. So I say all this to say that, you know, the task of defining astronism is one that will continue on. I'm getting better at doing it. It's taken quite a long time for me to be able to, you know, define astronism in a very succinct way. It's difficult, it's not easy, but I'm getting better. The Astronist Institution is getting better at defining its sort of interpretation of astronism, or Astronist orthodoxy. And of course, you know, as time goes on, the definitions of astronism will broaden. They will in some ways narrow down when we want to talk about a really specific aspect of astronism. It's because the reason why it's difficult is because astronism is so broad. It's so significant. It's so vast. So, you know, there's always going to be different aspects that you can focus on in the definition process. The point is just to enjoy the definition process, and, you know, just try and be as creative and but also as succinct and as descriptive as possible, really. Using every word, making every word count, essentially, is really the fundamental aspect of the sort of issue of trying to define astronism. So here we'll move on to subsection 2. This is only a really short aspect of sort of section of this lecture, and it's what we call the designation of astronism, or the designating of astronism. You know, how should astronism be described? How should it be designated? The questions, what is astronism and how should it be categorized, seem very simple ones. But when dealing with the belief system as complex and new as astronism, these questions become very complicated, particularly when people begin to project their views and connotations of different designations into the arena. In fact, these and similar questions have come to form a distinct discipline of astronist study, one that is tasked with sustaining the discourse around how astronism can be designated. This discipline is called meta-astronism, or meta-astronist theory. So what an aspect of meta-astronist theory focuses on is what we call the designating of astronism, or the designation of astronism. This is trying to understand how astronism can be categorized. So is astronism a belief system? Is it a religion? Is it a philosophy? Is it a political ideology? What is it? What is astronism? This is what designation theory is trying to really explore. and to come to terms with, and to come to, to come to grips with, really. So designation theory and designation denotes the task of placing astronism into a category, justifying its place within this category, identifying those aspects of astronism that suggest why it should be so designated, and analyzing what effects such a designation holds on astronism's functions and overall nature. So what I'm trying to say there is that if we're going to say that astronism is a religion, how does that affect sort of the way that we present astronism in terms of dissemination and promulgation? And how does that affect how the public sort of perceive astronism? Then, if they see it as a religion, are there negative connotations to religion that really do not encompass astronism, that do not relate to astronism, but people nonetheless relate them to astronism because of its designation as a religion? And again, you can go very specific with these types of designations. So you could have something like cosmocentric organized philosophy is a more narrow sort of a more specific designation, whereas you can go much more broad and leave it more sort of open and interpretive by using phrases such as life stance, that astronism is a life stance or belief system. Sometimes philosophy might be used in that as a kind of watered down version of a religion in some ways, in some connotations. And of course, what I've created is the category of astroncy, which is the specific category that I think astronism fits into and is the sort of founding member of. So, that will be used hopefully in the future, refer to astronism, but we can also still refer to it as a belief system, a philosophy, a life stance, a religion, so all these different aspects, all these different designations can all be used. It just depends on the context and the situation. How do you want to use it, and what effect do you want that designation to have, essentially? So it is a really important area and something that requires continual sort of exploration, really, sort of in a scholarly way. So within meta-astronism, designation theory specifically deals with this task, and is responsible for observing how designations of astronism are shifting all the time, both the language invoked by the institution, that invoked by non-astronist entities, and that invoked colloquially by astronists themselves. So what he's trying to say here is designation theory is following the language of astronism, really. It's kind of monitoring, really, how people are referring to astronism as a way to try and organize all the different ways that astronism can be described, essentially. So this was quite an important event. So the event, I think it's an inconventional event. It could be. Although it might not be, actually. The event, now appellated as the Great Elucidation, was an important one for the founding of era, as it involved my initial delineation of astronism as holding a four-pronged designation of philosophy, religion, ideology, and spirituality simultaneously, a combination of the four primary categories of belief systems at the time. Prior to my Great Elucidation, astronism was mainly understood as possessing philosophical and a religious, elements, but that these intermingled to form a singular whole. Meanwhile, the Great Elucidation called for astronism to be regarded and referred to according to these four delineated categories, with its beliefs and practices also organized accordingly. So what the Great Elucidation did was, it kind of said that, okay, we have these four primary categories of belief systems, these four primary designations. Let's merge them all into one, because that's what astronism truly is. It's a combination, really, of all of these four different categories of belief systems into a singular whole, and that it can function as a philosophy, as a religion, as an ideology, as a spirituality in different settings, that it has the capacity to do that. And so that's what the Great Elucidation was really talking about, and really tried to achieve. And I think it did achieve that to some degree. When we're talking about the intermingling of these elements of astronism into a whole, what I think really emerged later on was this belief system, or this category of belief system called astroncy. I really do think that that this astroncy belief category or designation was the result of the Great Elucidation. So that essentially the Great Elucidation had to happen. We had to merge all these different types of designations into sort of one for the use of astronism. But then what emerged following that was that this category or this designation called astroncy emerged as a result. This new sort of designation, this new way of understanding belief systems, and how to designate astronism emerged. So we have the Great Elucidation to thank really for even the concept of astroncy itself. So although the elucidationist approaches to astronist designation remain, influential within the institution, other currents continue to exist alongside it. We have this idea really of the organized philosophy, which is a designation that I used really throughout much of the founding era, up until really the last couple of years. The organized philosophy has significant origins within the omnidoxy. And has significant support within the omnidoxy, because it's an omnidoxical sort of term, really. And really what I think that means is that, an organized philosophy is kind of like a religion in a sense, but without the sort of elements of ritual, I would say. That's the main aspect. I mean, you could say that Buddhism is a kind of organized philosophy to some degree, especially in its Western conception, or humanism is an organized philosophy to some degree. So support for the concept of the organized philosophy remains strong, both for its dispensing with the term religion and for its unique use in relation to astronism. So, I mean, for me, I like to use the word religion, because I think it's a powerful word. It has a lot of power within it. When we start going into organized philosophy, I think these types of terms are good for scholars, or good for very for people who are, involved in the scene, I would say, of sort of the space movement. I would say that type of designation is good, but it's not really good for, the common garden person who doesn't have background knowledge really of the space movement, I would say. So in that sense, we'd have to use the word religion in order for them to understand what we're actually talking about here. What actually is astronism then? Because an organized philosophy may not really capture that for a common garden person. So we just have to be careful about what we really use there. More recently, in the last couple of months of the year of manifestation, the concept of astroncy has emerged, and it emerged with the Institutional Dictionary of Astronism. And so, this is the new sort of understanding that I have of how astronism should be designated, how it should be understood as a type of belief system in relation to, its designation. And I think that the term astroncy will be used more and more now, definitely by myself, but also by the institution. That does not mean that we will not be using, organized philosophy as well at some points. They're all part of astronism. They're all part of the history, the development of astronism, and the institution, again, will use terms for a set amount of time, and then it will move on from those terms and begin begin to use new ones. It's not always going to use the same terms. So because of the motional nature of astronism. So we need to, just understand that these terms are not set in stone. They're used for now, because that's the highest condition of how we can understand astronism at this present stage, essentially. So now that we've finished the designation theory, this episode is now coming to an end. As you can see there, section 4, we'll be looking at the Astronic tradition, which I've said is the oldest religious tradition, and I'll be exploring why I think that is the case, and my justification for why the Astronic tradition is the oldest religious tradition. So that's going to be a really interesting episode of a conversation with Cometan. I'm really excited to continue doing this total immersion into Astronism, and really just exploring astronism to great depths. Of course, sometimes in this episode, I've not been able to sort of explore some of the finer details of the Astronist philosophy, and some, important concepts have had to be missed out due to just timing constraints, and, my capacity to include everything. It's very, very difficult. So, I've just tried to capture the most important aspects. But there have been things that have been missed out that maybe aren't as important, but they're certainly interesting still. So anyway, enough about that. Just enjoy, this episode. I hope that you have. And I will look forward to seeing you in the next episode of A Conversation with Cometan. Bye, guys.